Russia can't survive sanctions. Here's why. In late February 2022,
to cancel a 1,000-year-old country. They're trying to cancel our people. I'm talking about the progressive discrimination of everything connected with Russia, about this trend that is unfolding in a number of Western states.
After years of disputes, conflicts, and threats, Russian soldiers began an invasion of Ukraine, their neighboring country. In response to this, the USA's Biden administration, rather than engaging in open conflict with the country, began imposing sanctions on Russia,
banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy,
in an attempt to hinder Putin's people's ability to live well. In response, Russia has imposed sanctions on the USA.
But Putin is accusing the West of trying to cancel Russian culture, including the works of several great Russian composers. He's called Russia another victim of West's cancel culture,
as if it's the start of an economic Cold War. But many are saying that the USA can hold on longer than the Russians will, and that is a subject worthy of some debate. Can Russia actually survive the sanctions? Some are saying no, they can't. So let's take a look at why. Background. The history of Russia and Ukraine goes back a long way, but for the purposes of analyzing the current situation, it's necessary to explore the origins of the Russo-Ukrainian War. While Ukraine was once part of the Soviet Union, they've been a sovereign nation since 1990. But in fact, this conflict began in February of 2014 when the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity occurred. This was a wave of huge protests that exploded in response to then-President Yanukovych's unexpected decision to not sign a political association and free trade agreement with the EU. What Yanukovych did instead was to choose closer ties to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. This was an incredibly unpopular decision, especially as the Ukrainian parliament had overwhelmingly agreed to finalize the agreement with the EU and distance the country from Russia. And in response, Russia had laid heavy pressure on Ukraine to reject the agreement. Protests were everywhere as Yanukovych sided with Russia, and the people began calling for the resignation of the president and the Azarov government. The protesters were fighting what they perceived to be widespread government abuse of power and corruption. In response, and in a tale that's become all too familiar these days, the government launched oppressive anti-protest laws, further removing human rights to free speech. Clashes in Kiev between protesters and police culminated in the deaths of over 100 protesters and 13 police officers, with many more people wounded. However, the protesters occupied government buildings and marched further and further, leading to the police withdrawal from central Kiev. As the protesters took over the center of the city, Yanukovych fled the city and then later the country. On that very day, the Ukrainian parliament voted to remove Yanukovych from office in a landslide majority. But Yanukovych, ousted from power and humiliated, asked Russia to help him. Russia refused to recognize the vote, calling it a coup. And the 8 years that have passed since that time have seen Russia annex Crimea, battles between separatists and Donbas, an increased military buildup along the Russia-Ukraine border, and finally, in the beginning of 2022, a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Invasion of Ukraine. The biggest reason for the latter is the involvement of NATO in Ukrainian affairs. NATO was, of course, created at the end of the Second World War as a way of preventing the same from occurring again. And Ukraine happens to be the place where NATO interests and Russian interests meet. NATO accused Russia of planning an invasion before they did, which was defined. Russian President Vladimir Putin was critical of NATO's enlargement and wished for Ukraine to be banned from joining the treaty organization. Of course, the vast majority of the international community have condemned Russia for invading Ukraine, because even though there are fair arguments on both sides, an assault on sovereignty is easy to comprehend. The latest developments have been financial sanctions thrown around, with most too afraid of a devastating nuclear conflict to do much more. Disrupting the markets. It's obvious that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is disrupting the world's markets, as international conflicts tend to do exactly that. Of course, a quick-fire succession of hefty sanctions imposed by the Biden administration has certainly had an effect on Putin's economy, as well as interrupting the lives of Russian citizens. The banning of imports into America of Russian oil and gas has come after months of warnings issued that if Russia invaded Ukraine, there would be appropriate sanctions. Of course, many believe that the sanctions are toothless and will not have much of an effect. while others suggest that they might be enough to cripple Russia into reconsidering its position. Certainly, Russia's economy is heavily reliant on exports of natural gas and oil energy sources, but another element to this that has been barely reported at all is the toll it takes on the American people as well. With gasoline prices skyrocketing, many Americans are having to abandon their vehicles altogether. Hubris. Some say the ban is an effective non-violent way of punishing Putin's hubris, while others say it short-sightedly cripples Americans just as much, if not even more, than it hurts Russia. Still, it is highly inconvenient for Russia's financial system, which must now ride out the storm. It has been said that as the world becomes smaller with each passing year, Russian citizens may have become accustomed to many of the trappings of Western-style life, and that these sanctions will be an effective way to make Putin unpopular with his own people. Putin is already not, as many would think, an overwhelmingly popular president, with about half of the Russian population against him on many issues, so this could in fact push that over the edge. Of course, it's more than just a fuel ban that has the Russian people being injected, as mobile payment systems, sporting and cultural events, online work platforms, even online entertainment platforms like Netflix have denied service to Russia. One of the most important things that needs to be discussed is just how badly inflation is going to rise for the Russians and the Americans. This is because there has been no real precedent set in modern history for the changes the Russian ruble has experienced since February. What sanctions? The sanctions have been in the works for some time, of course, as on February 21st, Biden's administration ordered sanctions on the separatist regions of Ukraine, as well as seizing the U.S. assets of many oligarchs tied to Putin. And the following day, the United Kingdom also targeted sanctions towards the same oligarchs, as well as multiple Russian banks. Further on from this, Germany halted the approval process for the 1,200-kilometer gas pipeline Nord Stream 2 that runs under the Baltic Sea. The pipeline is intended to take gas from the Russian coast near St. Petersburg to Lubmin in Germany. Despite the project being basically completed and costing 10 billion euros, that didn't stop Germany from freezing the whole project in the face of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This may have represented a moment where it became very clear that Europe was preparing for the potential for continental hostilities, but it does at least present a clear idea of the EU's attitude to the conflict. Russia's special military operation in Ukraine officially began on February 23rd, with the first ground troops entering the country on the following day, and the sanctions followed soon after, hitting members of the Russian parliament's lower house who voted for the invasion. One of the interesting elements that is said to be able to affect Russia the most is the fact that these sanctions will degrade the Russian space program by restricting aerospace and tech exports to Russia, at least according to Joe Biden. Sberbank, a Russian governmentally owned bank, was also excluded from the United States financial system. Financial cutoff. Still more followed, as on the 27th of February, BP announced that it will end its partnership with Rosneft, a Russian oil company, and will also divest the 20% stake it has had in the company. Next, on February 28th, the U.S. and its allies began efforts to have Russian banks removed from the SWIFT payment system. SWIFT is, of course, an acronym for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, which is a set of terminology that is highly beneficial, but whose benefits won't be benefiting Russia any longer. SWIFT actually provides a highly secure way for financial institutions the world over to exchange vital financial information about the transferring of money. While it doesn't actually move the money itself, it provides the verification process that means transactions are backed by security. The U.S. and allies have also turned against the Russian central bank, freezing its assets that are held overseas. This means the bank will be prevented from accessing the lion's share of its $640 billion stored in foreign currency reserves. In a conjunction between the United States and the European Union, the United Kingdom effectively cut the Central Bank of Russia completely off from the global financial systems. Of all the sanctions imposed on Russia, this is potentially the biggest blow that has been dealt to the Russian economy. Putin has spent the last 2 decades building one of the world's largest international reserves, comprising it not with Russian rubles, but in fact with euros and US dollars. It seems that this plan was basically to make sure that when he decided to move against the West, the Russian economy could be protected from the kinds of sanctions he expected would be coming from the central banks. It's a plan that implemented really stringent capital controls on the inside to attempt to conserve any foreign money that's there. KLEPTOCAPTURE. More recently, on the 2nd of March, the Department of Justice made an announcement of a task force called KLEPTOCAPTURE, whose task it is to go after the assets of the Russians that have been sanctioned. These are the oligarchs who are accused of being corrupt and making billions of dollars of the Putin regime. The only party that has not participated in the sanctions is the Chinese Communist Party, arguably because they have an interest in seeing who wins and taking their cues from Putin's measures versus what many countries believe is a toothless and incompetent Biden administration. It's certainly not surprising that other countries may develop a complacent attitude towards the United States after the catastrophic debacle that was the Afghanistan exit that took place last year. The corporate response. Meanwhile, however, major iconic American brands like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, McDonald's, and Starbucks, as well as big tech companies like Microsoft, Apple, and Netflix, have suspended services in Russia for the time being. McDonald's announced that it would be closing over 850 branches on Russian soil, which is also going to eliminate the income of those thousands of employees for the fast food giant. This is all well and good if you are anti-Russia, but they might be shooting themselves in the foot long-term by eliminating an entire and very large market. It is very clear that this is a two-pronged war, consisting firstly of the actual battle taking place in Ukraine, and then secondly between the board members of central banks around the world. Finally, the big hammer fell on March 8th, as the United States decided to ban the oil and gas imports from Russia. As mentioned earlier, oil and gas exports to the U.S. make up a large part of Putin's Russian economy, and Joe Biden thinks that this move will deal a hammer blow to Russia. The only problem here is that Biden and his administration don't seem to have realized the knock-on effects of such a move for the American citizenry, especially since Biden has also banned the production of fuels on American soil as well. Such a move is not helping as gas prices soar in the West. Attacks on many fronts. After invading Ukraine, Russia made efforts to insulate itself from the inevitable economic earthquake, but the broad scope of the sanctions imposed on the country is hitting Russia in such a diverse and inclusive group of ways that there aren't many sectors that remain safe. The sheer scope and variety of these sanctions is probably the most underappreciated aspect of the strategy, as some think they're a weak solution where soldiers should have been deployed. However, with NATO in the mix, an all-out battle will entice fingers closer to the nuclear button, while these sanctions, and the broad variety of them in nature, means a multifaceted, omnidirectional assault of the people of the country, which won't be good for Putin's popularity among his people. The true cost. The problem is, it's always the people who suffer. Jobs are being wiped out, money is becoming unavailable, and lines for ATMs are a mile long. Even the payment services that many use as an alternative are no longer available to the people, some of whom might be confused as the Russian state refers to the invasion as a special operation. One thing is for sure, and that is that no one is really winning as a result of this conflict. Putin looks unprepared and weak, the NATO and its allies look like they are doing very little, and the common people in all these countries are losing money to inflation, sanctions, financial freezes, and just not being able to get their own cash out in an ATM. This is without mentioning the plight of the Ukrainian citizens, who now find Russian soldiers in their streets. This goes on much longer, everyone will lose, not just Russia. What would you do about these sanctions? Is there a solution you think should have been taken? Say so in the comments section below. And don't forget to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell for notifications. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.